Hey, we lit. All right, we're lit. Okay, cool. So, I wanted to make this very simple, hopefully, walkthrough of like Git and GitHub because I feel like every time somebody starts talking about Git and GitHub, it gets super hard to see. It gets super hard to basically understand how to use this and leverage these things for yourself. So um, hopefully in the next couple of minutes, we go through a very simple walkthrough of like how to use Git and GitHub and what it's used for so that you're clear on like, hey, I use Git for this, I use GitHub for that, and where those lines get intersecting, and then also what commands we use for the Git stuff, what commands we need to use for the GitHub stuff, and you could feel like it makes more sense for your projects. So if you're ready to rock with me, just give me a thumbs up, you know what I'm saying? Just want to know that my homies are here, you know what I'm saying? Support your boy. You know what I'm saying? All right, let's do this. So here we're gonna actually start without any code for a second. The reason why is because I think it'll be helpful for folks to understand these two things without like from a non-code perspective first. So let's pretend I want to start drawing some stuff on this board and hopefully it's not too ugly, right? Let's pretend this big box is like our code folder, like a folder that we're going to put some code in. And maybe this big box is essentially a full stack application that we're going to work on. Or let's just say for the sake of making it easy for anybody that doesn't know full stack stuff, let's just say we're going to work on a website, right? So this is our folder for our website, right? And this particular folder in this box, right, is going to have a couple of different files in there, right? It might have a little HTML file, right? So I'll just put some sticky notes here to represent these different files. So it might have our little HTML file, right? It might have like a CSS file, right, for all of our styles. And it might have like, eventually, you know, you might add in there like a JavaScript file or two. You can have as many different files in this folder as you want, right? So if you think about it, every website has a series of files that make it a website. So these three might be our files, right? So throughout the process of you building your project, right, whether it's an amazing website that millions of people are going to use, or just a personal website that you're building for yourself, the process is the same in terms of how the website gets built, right? Before you actually have these three files, you kind of just have like an empty folder, right? There's nothing in there. And eventually you like start to add those things back in there and have like that folder starts to expand with code, with files, and each of the files themselves expand with what programmatically is going on inside of each file, right? So you start writing your HTML, you start writing your CSS, you start writing your JavaScript. So not only do you create these files, but these files start to expand with how many lines of code are inside of them. If you get what I'm saying, just give me a thumbs up, because fundamentally, that's what we're doing when we're coding. We're building these files to add code to the files, and in adding code to the files, things change in those files over time. Perfect. I see some thumbs. I like that. All right. So why can this process be a place where we want to be careful and mindful of like the changes we make? Well, sometimes, right? Most times when we're coding, things actually don't work the way that we expect them to. Like things actually break a lot when we're coding. Like we might write one bad line of JavaScript and suddenly this JavaScript file no longer works, right? And that file not working, or maybe I shouldn't delete it, but like this file not working can become a reason why our whole website stops working. And so with that being said, it's important for us to be thoughtful about, hey, you know, like I want to keep track of my files as I'm writing them. So if something breaks, it's easy for me to fix those changes or like go back to the point where things broke and identify what broke and make changes to it, right? So that level of specificity is hard to keep track of, right? Because like we said, not only are there new files being added, each file is going to be different at different points in time, right? And so in order to solve that problem of like keeping track of files that are going to have wildly different histories at different points in time, that's why the folks that created Git was to help us keep track of these files that we're working on over the course of us working on them in our website. So let's take, for instance, like the starting point of this website's history, right? So at like the first point of this website's history, right? It might look a little something like this. So I'm gonna write a new caption underneath this. I'm gonna say, you know, history 1, and we'll keep this, try to keep this a little bit more simple. But when you first, at the first point of this website's journey, it might actually start with just an empty folder, right? And then over time, right, you might actually see at step 2, hey, you know, somebody actually just now wrote that HTML file, right? And inside of that HTML file, they might have started some HTML code, right? And it might not be until like, you know, the next step after writing the HTML code that you actually see that the person's creating their next set of files, their CSS file, and you so on and so forth, right? Our website continuously changes in this kind of step-by-step fashion, where if you break it down, right, adding a file changes the history of our website, right? Changing a file changes the history of our website. And so what we want to do is have a tool that can manage all of those different histories over time. And what that tool is for all of us as engineers right now is Git. So what Git does is it's going to monitor our website or monitor our code folder, right, over time to see all of the different changes to the history that we make. And it can keep track of all of those changes so that eventually we can take a look at the different histories and say, hey, oh, I'm sorry, y'all, this is supposed to say history 3. If I look at history 2 versus history 3 of this same folder, right? This is the same folder for our website. I can see clearly that there's a difference between history 2 and history 3 in that history 2, there's only one file. In history 3, there's this new file added, right? So clearly there's a difference here. So what Git allows us to do is see, hey, there's a difference within these histories, because it can keep track of all the previous versions of our folder and our code. So we use a tool called Git in order to manage the different history, or I should say histories of our code. In this process of managing these different kind of histories, you can say histories, but some folks will say also versions, right? Histories, versions of our code. Sorry that this got a little messed up, right? So this is what Git is meant to do, is manage the different histories of our code, right, that we're working on. So we call Git a version control software. Like Git is titled a version control software because where we call it histories here, you could think of also as versions. So this could be version 1 of our code base looks like this. Version 2, version 2 might look like this, and then version 3 might look like that, right? So whether we think about it as a history or we think about it as versions, right, you can see clearly that there's different versions of the code within that folder over time. And what Git is made to do is to keep track of all of the different files and that are inside of a given folder, right? So for every file that's inside of this particular folder, Git can keep track of it so that we can see things like, hey, there's a difference in version 2 and version 3 because there's a new file, right? Quick pause for checks for understanding. Give me a thumbs up if that's making some sense to you, right? So we have these different versions of our code at different points in time, and we're gonna want to keep track of all of these different versions. And what Git will allow us to do is keep track of those different versions. Of course, right, we wanna know how it does that. And there's a lot that goes behind the scenes of Git to do that, but I'll try to break down some of the key concepts that you're gonna need to know when you're getting started. So the first key concept that you need to know is that when you're using Git, there's several key terminologies that you got to be familiar with in order to fully understand what's going on at different points in time. So the first step to keeping track of all of these different versions, step one is, and I'll put it here, step one is for us to create a new repository, right? Space this out some, right? Spelled that wrong. So we want to create a new repository, right? And a repository is essentially this box that is going to hold all of our different files over time, right? So let me just say, so create a new repository basically is us saying, hey, I'm creating one of these boxes that is going to hold all of the code. So we normally will create this box as a folder on our computer, right? That folder is going to contain the files that eventually we're going to add to the different to be the pieces to our website, right? Or our application or whatever we're building. But the idea is that within that folder, we're actually going to start what's called a repository, which basically Git will use that folder to then track all of the different files that we're going to be building over time. So a repository kind of is related to the folder that you're holding your files in, but the repository is a very specific thing that we add via Git in order to start keeping track of all the files inside of a particular folder. So basically we need the folder of the code, but then we create and tell that folder, hey, we're going to add Git inside of you so that you can, so Git can keep track of any changes that we add to that very specific folder. So to show you this, right, to kind of get from high level to back to technical level, let's take a look at this in like VS Code real quick. So let's say I start a new project and I'm like, okay, I want to create a new project for this website, right? So I'm going to just open a new folder that I'll use to kind of hold that code. Again, I told y'all, and I tell y'all all the time, I love working in folders. I like starting my code, working in folders. Every time I open something in VS Code, I try to open it in a folder because it'll just make all of this stuff with Git and GitHub make a lot more sense. So I'm just going to create a new folder and I'm just going to call it Git website example for y'all, right? So clearly this is a folder. I just created a new folder, and when I open it, right, the idea is that in VS Code, that new folder, there's nothing inside of it. It's just a folder, right? So it is very much the same as this particular version of the code as we have right now. Version 1 is just an empty folder. So what I want to do is set this folder up to be able to be monitored by Git. And so to do that, I need to create a new repository inside of this folder. In order to do that, right? In order to do that, there's a couple things you got to do first. The first thing is you got to go and download Git to your machine. You can do that by going to the git-scm website and just clicking on the download for whatever operating system you're using. Once you download Git, it should allow for you to start running some commands in your developer environment of choice. So what creating a repository is basically saying, hey, inside of some folder, I'm going to initialize Git inside of this folder. That is what creates a repository. So what I'm going to do is just here, I'm underneath this step, I'm going to actually write out the command that you're going to see me write. So I'm going to type in a command in a second that's called git init. And git init is the command that I type in order to create a new repository. So in VS Code, right, I have this folder. There's no files in there, right? Sorry, y'all, VS Code want to pop up with all the pop-ups right now. There's no files in here, right? But I still want to create a new Git repository in here. So what I'm going to do is this folder, one of the reasons why I love opening things in folders is because it makes it very easy for in VS Code for me to open a new terminal inside of that folder. So just by clicking terminal and new terminal, I can open up a new terminal window directly into that folder. And by doing that, right, I can start actually typing some commands into that particular, I can start typing some commands for this particular folder. So once you have Git installed on your machine, right, the first command you want to run when it comes to creating a repository is git init. And so being mindful, right, this is my folder. I'm inside of that folder that I just created. It's empty, but when I run this command git init, it's going to initialize a new Git repository in that particular folder for me. I can confirm this by running the command ls-a, which will show all of the hidden files also within this repository. So you can see that there's a new folder that gets created called .git. This folder is Git, and it does everything that Git will do for me is contained within this one little folder. So the .git folder for me is going to be my new repository. So when we see initialize an empty repository, that is me saying, okay, cool, I took this folder and I just created my new repository. The value of me creating the new repository is that now, because I have Git inside of this particular folder, right, every version of the code that is different than the version that it has last seen Git will be able to know that there is a difference in the repository. There's a difference in terms of the files that are added, or there's a difference in the actual file itself. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. If I go back to VS Code, right, I'm just gonna clear so that the command line is a little bit emptier. If I run the command git status right now, right, you can see that it says, hey, I'm on this branch called master. We'll talk about that in a second. There's no commits yet. And there's nothing to commit. There's no files in here. So it says, hey, create and copy files and add using git add to track them. So Git is basically telling me that there's no files that are in here that it's seen in this particular repository. Everything is completely empty. But it is introducing me to our next Git command that we're going to need to use, which is git add. So basically, ignoring Git for a quick second, right? My folder is empty. There's nothing in here, but I know I'm building a website. And for everyone that knows about websites and how they're built, and I talk a lot about it in some of the other videos on the page, in order for you to build a website, you need HTML, right? HTML files are like the heart of a website. So if this is going to be a website, it's natural that at one point I'm actually going to create a new file in here, and that will be like this HTML file, just like as we see kind of here, right? Now that I added this particular file, right, maybe I actually go ahead and fill it out with a little bit of HTML, right, and just kind of get the ball rolling a little bit on having some code in here. And just kind of get a little basic HTML file in here, right? So if I didn't know if I wasn't really working with Git, I might go all the way up to this point where I'm like adding this actual file, this HTML file into my folder, because I know, hey, in order to build a website, I need a file that has HTML. Just like if I'm building a Java app, I'm gonna need a main Java file. Or if I'm building an iOS app, I know I'm gonna need to start my project in Xcode and create my Swift files. Or if I'm building a Python app, I know I'm gonna need some Python files, right? You know, based on what you're building, the types of files you need to start your projects with. And typically you're gonna just start writing those files. The value of Git though is in the folder that you're saving these files to, the more that you change them, Git can take a look at those changes inside of itself. So as you can see, I run this other command, git status, and it's showing me how there's now a new file in here that's quote unquote untracked, right? Basically, this file is the file I just created, and it being untracked means that Git sees that there's this new file in here, but this file itself is not being watched yet in the repository. It basically says, hey, I see that there's this new HTML file in here. What do you want to do with it because it's different than what was previously inside of this folder, right? And Git will show you things that are, it will always show you, hey, there's a difference. There's a different file in here. There's a difference inside of this file for you to keep track of, right? So what I want to do is, as I'm making these changes to this file, to this folder and repository that's on my, in this folder, right? I want to keep track of all of the changes. And so in order to keep track of all the changes, I need to add any new file that I'm working with in order to be included in what's going to be monitored by Git. To do that, I'm going to use another command to add specific files into the history for Git to keep track of. So I'm going to just move this definition of Git up some. And basically, we started off with this empty repository. And right now, we're still dealing with version 1. So you can see I just kind of created this HTML file. The next thing I want to do to really create a solid understanding and version of this code is I want to actually create and track this. I want to add this new file to Git history, basically, right? To do that, I'm going to use a command called git add. And this is going to allow me to add a specific file to my Git history. So let me just fix this, right? So step 1 is always like, okay, create your repository. That's this little box here, right? Step 2 is I want to add my file or files to my Git history. And I do that using the git add command, right? In this case, I only have one file. It's this HTML file. But ultimately, I might want to add all of my files. Like if I had these other files, I might want to add all of them. And I'll show you the command you can use. So git add is what we use to add files. So in here, right, I have this index.html file that's saying it's untracked. Git sees it, but hey, it's not added yet. And it even tells you in the command output that, hey, you can add a specific file to include it in what will be later committed, right? It says nothing added to the commit, but there are untracked files present. Use git add to track. So basically, it's trying to tell you, hey, you have some files in here, and you just let us know if you want to add it to the history or not, right? Of course, I want to add it to the history. So there's 2 ways I can do that. One way is to add it very specifically, like it's saying here, git add, and then the file to add it. So I could say git add, and then specify, hey, I want to add this index.html file into the history. So you can see it's still using the git add command, but it's specifying the name of the file. If I run that, right, and I do a git status is just a helper command. You can see me, I'm using it so much, but it's just a helper command to let you see what Git is seeing right now, right? So git status will let you say, oh, okay, based on where Git is right now, it's still on this branch called master. There's no commits yet. And it says there's changes to be committed. Now I've made a change that can be committed. The change is this adding of this new file called index.html, right? It even shows you if I want to not commit this file, if I want to get rid of that change that I just added, I can use this command, git remove, to remove that particular file from the history. What we're doing is saying, hey, Git, there's a new file. And what Git is going to do is keep track of that file as a part of our different versions of our website. I can see already. I said it was going to be simple, but it's simple-ish. Git is complicated. It's not an easy thing to talk about. But basically, right, it says, hey, okay, we have this new file, this index.html file, right? The next thing I want to do in order to fully create a version, right, of this is I want to commit. I want to basically commit that version. I want to commit that version to the history, right? And so to commit a version of anything to the history, I just need to have the different files I want to add. And to be a little bit more clear on the language, when I'm adding these files to the Git history, I'm actually adding them to what we call a commit. And a commit is essentially just a commit is almost like a snapshot of the versions of the code at different moments. And we add all the files that we want to that particular snapshot at any given moment. So the commit is theoretically where the history is looking at, is all the commits we've made. But in order to make a commit, right, I need to add specific files to that particular commit. So if this is my first version of the website, right, I have a folder, I have this HTML file, and I'm like, hey, I want to save version 1, right? I could just save version 1 by command save, but what Git allows us to do is save the difference of the file over time, right? So if something goes wrong in version 1, or version 100, I can always go back to version 1 because I've saved it using Git. That's the value of having these commits, is to go back to the different commits that we've made, which theoretically the commits you could think of as the different versions that we have on record. Every commit is made up of different files, and whatever the status of those files are in terms of what code is inside of each file. So we use git add to make the commit, but then we can use the git commit command in order to actually make our commit, our first versions of the code. So to do that, right, the command you want to use is git commit, but git commit takes in a couple extra parameters in order to make a full commit. The first is this -m flag, which is going to specify a particular message that is this commit is going to be saved as. So basically, we get an opportunity to quick save our files and give it a name, give that particular save a name. And so in this case, I might say adding HTML file, right? Because I know, hey, at this point of the code history, this is when I added the HTML file, right? The git commit -m, and then open some quotes, and then some message kind of goes here. That's just the format for making a commit on Git. We add our files, we physically add our files, do whatever we wanted to. Those create changes. We add the particular file that we see are different or any changes, and then we commit them and create a version of our repository with that particular version of the code. So as you're about to see, this is literally the process of making the commits and stuff on Git and we repeat this process over and over and over again. So let's say in version 2, so now that I have version 1 saved, right? Let's say in version 2, I want to have not only this HTML file in here, I also want to add, like I did here, add this CSS file as well, right? So I know a new version of the code, when I'm ready to actually kind of create a new version, I'm gonna wanna have both the HTML file that I just had and this CSS file, right? Well, I've already made the HTML file, so it seems like all I have to do next is add the CSS file and create a new commit version, right? So to do that, right, just like I would normally, I would go ahead and continue to work on my code and say, okay, I made my HTML file, but now I want to create my CSS file, right? And now that I have a CSS file, even though there's nothing in there, right? Just the fact that I created the file, let me clear this one more time. If I do git status, again, let's just take a look at what's going on. VS Code is helpful because you also can see from these little letters next to your files, if a file gets created and there's a U next to it, it means that Git has it untracked, meaning it's not fully connected to the Git history yet. But it sees that it's a change in the repository. So if I do git status, you can see clearly there's that change. The styles.css is here, but it's saying, hey, add this file if you want it to be committed to your next version. Otherwise, you could just leave it be, but Git will ignore it or not. You won't have it in your history. Because I do care about the changes that are happening to this file, I'm gonna add it, right? But instead of just adding it, like I told you, you could type in the name of that particular file that's different. If you have 100 files that are different, and let's say in this case, like maybe I have a couple other files that I changed, right? A very cool shortcut for git add command. Remember, we always are going to end up using git add, but a shortcut command you can use to add a bunch of files that might have been changed is git add dot. So git space add space dot, which will add all of the files inside of your folder that might have been changed since your last commit, since your last version, right? So git space add space dot will, in effect, do the same thing as git add styles.css. But if I have 100 other files in here, it will also add those files as well. So if I do a quick git status one more time, you can see that it says, hey, we got that new file added, and we can commit it, right? So in order to make a commit, I always will need to add the files that I'm looking at and then make that commit with some message. So the next step I want to do here is make that commit and just say added initial CSS file, right? And now I've made 2 commits, right? So now I have version 1 where it's just this HTML, and I have version 2 where we have the HTML and the CSS. I'll show you this in Git real quick because, again, the value of using Git is that I can look back at all of these different versions of my code. So if I go in the terminal, clear this one more time, and then do a git short log, you can see I've made 2 commits, right? And here are the 2 commits, one for adding the HTML file and then the other for adding that initial CSS file. If I do the git log command, which is essentially like the git short log, but it's just a little bit longer in terms of all the details it gives you, you can see that not only do I have a timestamp for each of the commits, so I can see which commit is happened latest, I also get those messages back. So I can say, okay, bet, this particular commit is when I added that initial HTML file. This particular commit was when I added the CSS file. And you can see that Git also gives us this very long, unique ID for that commit. It's a hashed value for this commit. This value and referencing this value will allow me to reference these different versions over time. So you can see clearly it's not as simple as version 1, version 2. You can think of it like that. And if you leave commit messages that are this specific, it's easy for you to kind of say, okay, this is version 1, version 2, blah, 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 blah. But with Git, it actually does it with this very long, unique commit ID. And it's a little bit outside the scope of what I want to talk about right now, but there's a command that we can use in Git to go back to these very specific commit IDs. And that's what allows us to go and check out the code at different moments. The point is with Git, we can start to keep track of any changes that we make to this file. So just again, to show you the point, like, let's say now I'm like, okay, cool, I want to add my JavaScript file. So I'm just going to say index.js. So now I have this new file. Again, it's like rinse and repeat, right? If I do git status, clearly there's a change in this folder, in this repository. So I'm going to want to keep track of those changes. So I'm going to do a git add to add all of the changed files, right? Do another git status one more time to just confirm, hey, this was changed. I don't have to run git status. I just like to run it because it gives me some more perspective on what's going on. But now that I made that change, right, I might want to commit it and just say, hey, git commit -m, and then the message might be adding initial JavaScript file, right? So now if I do the short log, I can see all 3 of my commits are in, right? So basically Git is just monitoring this folder for any changes to the code within the folder. And when it sees that there's a change in the folder, it kind of like tells me, hey, you know, you have this file that's untracked. Like it kind of puts like this little marker on it and says, hey, this file is untracked. You see this little red thing, it's like untracked, until I do a git add, right? And git add will then make it so that, okay, this file no longer is untracked. I'm trying to get rid of the tag, right? It makes it so that now, you know, okay, this file is no longer untracked. It's now a part of, it's now able to be committed, right? So I use the commit message and commit something. And now that will create this new version of the code for me, right? So whenever we make a change, so I'll just show you this in a hopefully easier to see way, right? So whenever I make a change to this file, right? Let's say I make a change to the HTML. What Git is going to tell me is, hey, this particular file is untracked. There's a change here that's not being tracked in the history. There's a difference between version 3 of what we saw and version 4 of what we see, right? So then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to add and commit those changes to basically make it so that there's a clear, basically make it so that version 4 has a clear commit of all of the changes that we see here. So by doing that, then this will go from being untracked to being tracked, and we're going to have a clear version for it. So let me just show you that broken down, right? So again, the idea is like, if I make a change to this HTML site, what Git is going to tell me is, hey, we have a change that's untracked, right? So if I go back to our HTML, and inside of the head, maybe I say, okay, let's just create that link to our style sheet. CSS, right? So I just kind of create a quick change in this HTML site. Basically, for those of y'all that don't fully know HTML, all I'm doing is just connecting this HTML file to this CSS file, right? So I save this. I clearly have just made a pretty interesting change to the HTML. And then if I do like we were doing before, and I go ahead and just do a git status in the terminal, you can see it's showing me that I've modified index.html, right? So it's going to tell me that it's telling me that there's a change. So in this case, instead of it showing me that it's untracked, because the HTML file is already in the history, it's actually showing me that this file is modified. So it's still kind of showing me that there's a change, but there's two different versions of changes. One version is, hey, you have a whole new file that I've never seen. Or, hey, you have a file, clearly I've seen it since version 1. This file's been here for a while, but there's a change inside of this file. It's modified, right? But the point is the same, that because there's a modification, I need to let Git know, what do I want to do with this particular file? Do I want to add it to this next commit? Or do I want to discard the changes that were made to that particular file? So it's showing me a couple different options. Most times what you're going to want to do is add the file, because if you didn't like the changes you just made, you might go back and, get rid of those changes. So like if I go ahead and delete this, right? Delete this to even go back to what it was before, right? What's interesting is if I go ahead and do a git status now, you can see that because I went back to what it was originally and I did git status, it shows that there's no changes. It's like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I saw in the last version, right? But as soon as I make that change, right, it's like, oh, hey, bruh, you got a different, I didn't save it. You got a different version of this particular file. This file's been modified, right? So that's why Git is cool. It's super smart. It's seeing like, hey, at the level of the file, this is different than the file that we've seen before. Because there's a difference, right? I gotta still do that same flow of add all of the changes, all the modifications. I like to do the git add dot shortcut just because it just makes it so I don't have to type in the name of this file every time, right? And by doing that, now that modified file is now added to the next commit to be made. So now I get rid of this little indicator that says, hey, this modified file, what do you want to do with it? So now it's here. The next thing I want to do though is make this commit so that I can have an actual version 4 of my code. So here I'll just say git commit -m, and I might leave a message like connected HTML and CSS, right? And so with that, right, now I have all 4 of these commits made the way that they need to be made. If I go ahead and do the git short log one more time, clearly I can see all 4 of my different commits. You can think of these 4 commits as the different versions of my code at different times, right? Version 1, I was just adding that HTML file. At this version, I was adding that CSS file. This version, I added the JS. And now I'm starting to actually work with each of those files more specifically, right? The thing is that at every step of the way, Git is going to look inside of this folder to see, hey, what has changed inside of this particular folder, right? Are there new files that have come up, or are there new changes to an existing file that we already had? And if there is, it asks us, hey, what do you want to do with this change that we've noted, right? What do you want to do? Do you want to create a new version of this code? We see a different version of the code. Do you want to create a new commit? Do you want to save this version, right? A commit is basically just a saved version of our code at a different period of time. And so to make those commits, we take a look at whatever's changed, we add it, and then we commit, right? In this case, I was using git add dot, but then git commit to make those commits, right? And this is everything Git does for us, right? All out of the box, all I gotta do is initialize it into my folder, add the files, and then add it to Git and commit them, right? And that process of add commit continuously happens so long as I'm making changes, right? So if I go here and I say, cool, I'm gonna make this change to my JavaScript and just write a little JavaScript, you know what I'm saying? Hello world, right? Well, now, if I go into the Git status, clearly this file has now been modified. So Git saying, hey, you have a change here. What do you want to do? Well, I want to add it to my next history change, right? So git add dot to add it to the next version, and then git commit will actually make that version. So hello world in JavaScript, right? So every time you're working, you're going to see yourself making this pattern all the time. Make the files, change the files, add the changes, commit the changes, right? Add the changes, commit the changes, add the changes, commit the changes. That happens repeatedly until you're basically done with your project. Or in the case of most teams, until you're ready with the changes you've made to send your changes somewhere for other people to review. And that is where Git becomes, that's where Git ends and GitHub kind of becomes a bigger picture player in what you're building, right? Because everything we were just doing, all these different versions exist on our local computer, which means that only we have access to this, right? But if I have teammates and I want those teammates to get access to this, I need to push this history to a place where those team members and other folks can reference it, right? And that is, my friends, what GitHub is for. It's a space for us to push this entire history that is now being monitored in Git, right? To a place where other people can access it and take a look at it. And that's what we use GitHub to do for us. And to do that, right, all I'm going to do, and again, I might have to do another one of these in the future to just kind of break down some more of the more sophisticated aspects of GitHub and even Git as well. But let's say now I'm at this point where I'm like, okay, I want to push this to GitHub for my colleagues to see, right? Well, all you got to do now is create a new repository on GitHub, right? GitHub is just going to be a place to hold all your code from your repository all the different the history of the commits you've already made. So here you just got to create a new repository for yourself. So here I'm just going to give it the same name. I'll just say GitHub website demo or whatever. I don't remember what I named this. What I named it? GitHub website example. Right. And so in here, I don't really need any of these extra stuff. I'm just going to skip it for now. And you can skip it yourself. Right. And basically, what you're going to end up doing is connecting your Git repository, the one we made, right? This repository that we initially created that's inside of this folder. We have to connect this repository to GitHub, right? And so to do that, we're going to use a command that is going to say, hey, take this repository that I made, and essentially we're going to take a copy of this whole history and push it to GitHub, right? But for now, this repository has no idea about GitHub. It has no clue what GitHub is or where it's at, right? So when we create a new repository on GitHub, it gives us a command that we use to basically link our repository, to GitHub. So let's say I'm going to just create another big shape here. And let's say that down here somewhere is GitHub, right? So the idea is that if this is GitHub all the way over here, right? Well, I need a way to connect this like repository and all this history to the GitHub, right? And so to do that, I'm gonna have to figure out a way to like basically like link these two things, right? And let me just move this line a little bit so it's out of the way, right? So I'm gonna need a way to link this repository I made to GitHub, right? Well, that's what this first command is going to do. Git remote add origin. This command is used to create a link between your repository on Git in your local folder to GitHub. So that command is really responsible, right? You'll see that anytime you run this command, it looks something like git remote add blah, 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 and then blah, blah, blah. There's two big things that kind of get put into that git remote command, right? And I'll talk about one, two in a second. So this is the git remote command. And this command basically just going to create a connection between our repository and GitHub, right? There's two variables that we pass into this command. Number one is kind of like what we call an alias. And this is just like a unique name for this link, right? So you can have multiple types of places like GitHub. You can actually connect your same repository to multiple GitHub repositories if you want. But the idea is anytime you want to make this link, this little link, this line from your repository to GitHub, you need to give that command git remote add a name for that particular link. And then number two would be clearly that actual link to the GitHub repo or to the external, obviously external / GitHub repo. And I'll make this look nicer for y'all, right? So we need to connect our code to GitHub, right? That's definitely number one, right? To do that, we use this git remote add command, and we give it an alias, which is this first thing, and then we give it a link to that actual repo. So in the case of what we see from this GitHub example, we see that it created an alias, right? The alias is called origin. So origin is now like a name to reference this particular link. So this is the link. So this is the alias, this is the link. Basically what we're doing though is creating, oops, I'm sorry, I keep clicking this. Basically we're creating this link right here from our old repo to GitHub. And that link has, that link is now gonna be called origin. So what I end up doing, right, in order to connect my code to GitHub is I gotta go back to VS Code where I've done all these commits and everything, and I'm gonna create that connection to that particular link to GitHub, right? Mind you, right now I'm on HTTPS. This is a little bit different when you do SSH, but on HTTPS, if you click HTTPS, all you're gonna do is connect this to this particular link. If you're doing SSH, you connect to a different particular link. So if this is your first time, just make sure you click HTTPS and you can copy this and it'll give you a link to GitHub that looks something like this, HTTPS, GitHub, blah, 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 right? So that's the first command. The second command is a command that GitHub is doing to make it so that instead of how to describe this, basically every repository, right, we have these different versions. And so a more advanced topic of Git is that you can actually create different copies of your versions to monitor over time. And you can give those different copies names. So right now, the original copy of our versions is called main. It's given this name called main. Or it's given this name, excuse me, it's given this name called master, right? And so if we were to like look at the different versions of our code, there's a reference called master that is looking at all of these versions we've made so far. What GitHub is doing with this second command is just changing the name of this from master to main. So it's saying, hey, instead of calling this first version history master, we're just gonna rename this to be called main. It's not a crazy thing, but the reason it's important is because in this third command, which is really important, they reference it being called main instead of called master. And so that's why you see this command here before this one. By the way, all we're doing is taking this, We can run this in our VS Code as well. It just renamed this thing as main. So you can see if you were paying attention on the bottom left, it was called master originally. Now it's called main. If I do get status, or if you remember get status, it kept telling me on branch master, but now it's saying on branch main. So it just renamed it for me. The third command though is the command that actually does the work of taking this version history, all of our different commits that we've made, and pushing them to GitHub, right? So step one, if this was the first thing I needed to do, right? The next thing I needed to do was, I'll just make this a little smaller. At first I had to create this connection to GitHub, right? The thing right after that I needed to do was I needed to push my changes to GitHub, right? And so this is kind of how you see it set up, where there's a command called git push that basically is going to push all of this history that we just made to GitHub. But it does it because it references that alias that we talked about before. So when you do git remote add, you add a particular alias. When you push, you reference the alias and the what we call branch that you want to push to somewhere. So because we only have one branch, this branch is basically the name of all of these different versions of our code right now. This copy of our code versions. We're saying, hey, push our kind of current changes, our current commit history to origin, which is that GitHub link that we just added, to a new branch on GitHub called main, right? So this is basically saying push all of our changes that we called main to GitHub also and call it main as well. Again, it's kind of hard to describe that without getting into crazy detail, but what I'm going to do is just copy this, go ahead and paste this here. And as you can see, if you see something like enumerating objects, compression, blah, 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 and you see something like this, branch blah set up to track origin blah, this is showing that we just took our main branch and we have now created a connection to GitHub, which is referenced as origin, to another branch also called main. But this is what you see when you've done a successful push to GitHub, is kind of something like this. If it's not successful, you'll see some error messages, etc. But I can now, after copying these 3 pieces of code from GitHub, if I refresh, I can see now those files and my commits, my commit history is here. So look at the commit history. I can see that these are the exact same commits that I was just making in GitHub or in Git on my local computer, right? But now I can view them on GitHub, and anybody on my team can see these now because they're here. They also have those commit hash values, those unique values that we were talking about before, and the date and time in order to show us, like, which was when the recent changes and whatnot. As you can see, this is in a what we call branch called main. The branch basically just holds this various history of the code. And the thing you can do that's a little advanced is you can create multiple branches in Git and GitHub, but I'll save that for another day. But yeah, y'all, to just kind of sum it all up, right? We create our code by way of making these folders, and each folder is going to have different files over time, right? What Git allows us to do is to monitor these folders by creating a new repository inside of a folder. We can keep track of all the different versions of changes that are going to be made to this folder over time, whether that looks like us adding files, right? Or it looks like changes between the same file, right? Git can check out those modifications that we're making, and we can then add those changes, right, and commit them to history so that Git can keep a snapshot of each of these particular versions. And so in order to create these versions, you just add the changes and you commit them. When you commit them, you leave some message so that later you can see all of those different commits with the message so that hey, adding HTML file, right? I just added the HTML file. one thing that you can do is look at the files at that point in time, and you can see at that point, all I had was just an index.html file, right? But at the point of adding initial JavaScript file, or if we even do adding initial CSS file, right? If I take a look at browsing the files here, well, now at this version of code, I actually have 2 files, right? And I could look through each of these files. This is what I mean that with Git, we can look at each commit and see the different changes at different points in time, right? Clearly, when I did the commit for adding the initial JavaScript file, right? That was when now I had 3 files, right? Because I kept that many, I made that many commits so I could see at any point in time, like, you know, what was added and stuff. So Git is cool because it keeps track of all of these different changes. And all you have to do is create the repository and add the changes and commit them. But when you're ready for someone else to see those changes, that's when we actually make this push from our local code to GitHub. And what we're doing is basically connecting our repository of code, our folder, with a link to GitHub or to another external repository. We give it an alias or a unique little name, and then we push, right? So pushing is how we actually send the files to a remote repo. And in most cases, right, that remote repo might be GitHub, or, you know, it could be there's a couple other places where people are saving their code. So I know it is not as simple as I would have hoped. It started out simple, but then it got not simple. But Git helps us manage the different histories and the versions of our code. So long as you understand that, and you understand that you can use Git to create these versions by adding your changes and committing them, you're good. GitHub comes in when you're saying, hey, I'm ready for somebody else to take a look at this history of my commits. And we just create a connection to GitHub, and we push our changes to GitHub for somebody else to see. So yeah, y'all, this is my simplest breakdown of what Git and GitHub is doing. I hope that it helps. If it did, just throw some thumbs up for your boy, so I feel like I wasn't just talking for forever and a day.